In the small, forgotten town of Hollow Creek, death was a ritual. It wasn't like in other places, where the dead were simply buried or cremated. No, here, the dead left their sins behind, and one man took it all upon himself. The Sin Eater. His name was Samuel Cobb, and he'd been Hollow Creek's Sin Eater for as long as anyone could remember. His father had been one before him, and his father's father before that. It was a family tradition, though not a chosen one. When someone in the town died, Samuel was summoned. He'd come to the house of the deceased with his worn leather pouch, filled with herbs, bread, and salt. He'd kneel at the foot of the bed, and the family would gather around, watching in silence as Samuel ate the bread placed on the chest of the dead. It was a symbol, a ritual, one that transferred the sins of the deceased into the Sin Eater. Only once Samuel had finished could the body be buried, cleansed of its sins and free to move on. Samuel had been doing this for decades. And with each death, with every bite of that ritualistic bread, the weight of Hollow Creek's sins bore down on him. He lived alone in a rundown cabin on the outskirts of town, isolated from the people he saved. People didn't look him in the eye anymore. They avoided him on the streets. They feared him, though they'd never say it aloud. To them, he was a necessary evil. But something had changed in Hollow Creek recently. Deaths had become more frequent, more violent. People were dying in strange ways, accidents that made no sense, illnesses that came out of nowhere, suicides by those who had no reason to end their lives. The town was decaying, falling apart, and with every death, Samuel was summoned, eating the sins of the fallen, taking them into himself. It was eating him alive. One night, after another grueling ritual, Samuel stumbled back to his cabin, his mind foggy, his stomach churning from the weight of another's sins. He collapsed into his chair by the fire, a groan escaping his lips. His hands were shaking. They'd been trembling more often lately, and his vision had started to blur. It wasn't just the sins, the people who had died recently, something was wrong with them. Their sins tasted different, darker. As if the evil inside them had grown, festering, infecting more than just their bodies. Samuel rubbed his temples, trying to block out the murmuring voices that had started to plague him. He could hear them all the time now. They were faint, whispers just on the edge of his perception, but they were there. Sins. The dead were calling to him, the sins of Hollow Creek haunting him even when he was awake. He tried to push the voices away, tried to drown them out with drink or distraction, but it was no use. That night, the whispering grew louder. Samuel stood abruptly, knocking his chair over. His head throbbed with the noise, and he stumbled toward the door, flinging it open. Outside, the forest was silent, dark, but the voices followed him. They were everywhere. He could hear them in the wind, in the rustling of the leaves, in the very earth beneath his feet. The sins of Hollow Creek, all inside him, all screaming for release. He walked deeper into the forest, no longer aware of where he was going. The voices guided him, leading him through the thick trees and twisted branches, pulling him toward something waiting for him. After what felt like hours, Samuel emerged into a small clearing. In the small clearing stood a figure, tall, skeletal, and cloaked in darkness. It wasn't human. Its skin, if you could call it that, was stretched tight over bones that jutted out unnaturally. Its eyes were hollow, glowing with a sickly yellow light, and its mouth, twisted into a grin too wide, too knowing. Samuel froze. The voices were louder now, deafening. His heart pounded in his chest as the figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. Samuel's legs trembled, but he couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot. "You've been eating them, haven't you?" the figure hissed, its voice a deep, rasping growl that reverberated in Samuel's skull. "The sins. Taking them into yourself, how noble." Samuel opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his tongue heavy with fear. The creature circled him slowly, its glowing eyes locked on his. You've taken in more than any man should. Do you feel it, Sin Eater? The weight of their darkness. It's been corrupting you. Little by little. Feeding on you. Samuel's mind raced, but he couldn't process what the creature was saying. His body felt cold, his skin prickling as the wind howled through the trees. You're not just eating their sins, the creature continued, leaning in close. Its breath was foul, rancid. You're feeding me. I'm the one who takes what you eat. And the more you consume, the stronger I become. Samuel's stomach churned, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. This thing had been growing stronger with every ritual, every death. He'd been unknowingly feeding it for years, giving it the power to spread its curse over Hollow Creek. It wasn't just the people who were dying, it was the town itself, rotting from the inside out. And Samuel was the cause. I didn't know, Samuel croaked, his voice barely a whisper. Oh, but you did, the creature hissed, its grin widening. Deep down, you knew. You could feel the change inside you. You could taste the rot. But you kept eating. You kept going. You couldn't stop, could you? Samuel's legs gave out, and he fell to his knees in the dirt, his body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The weight of everything he'd done, every sin he'd consumed, it was too much. The voices in his head screamed louder, clawing at his mind, tearing at his sanity. What do you want from me? Samuel gasped, his vision blurring. The creature crouched down in front of him, its face inches from his. It's simple, it whispered. I want more. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. More? More what? More death. More sin. The people of Hollow Creek are corrupt, broken, and I want every last one of them. And you, Samuel, you will help me. Samuel shook his head, tears streaming down his face. No. No, I won't. I can't. You will, the creature growled. You're bound to me now. You've taken too much into yourself. You can't escape it. The more you resist, the more you suffer. You're mine. Samuel clutched his chest, the weight of the curse crushing him from the inside out. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The pain was unbearable. Break the cycle, Samuel, the creature hissed. Or die in agony. Either way, I win. When Samuel awoke, he was back in his cabin. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows across the room. His body ached, his mind reeling from the encounter. He wanted to believe it was a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by the stress of the ritual. But deep down, he knew the truth. The creature was real. And it was hungry. Samuel stayed in the cabin for days, not daring to leave. But the town wouldn't let him rest. They needed him. People kept dying, and without the Sin Eater, they couldn't move on. The voices returned, louder and more insistent. The sins inside him festered, demanding to be fed. One morning, there was a knock on the door. It was Mrs. Harper, an old widow from the town. Her son had died in a freak accident. She needed Samuel to perform the ritual. He tried to refuse, but she wouldn't leave. She begged, pleaded with him, her eyes filled with desperation. Samuel knew he couldn't hide forever. He couldn't escape the duty he was bound to. The curse had its claws in him now, and it wouldn't let go. He agreed to perform the ritual. That night, as he knelt beside the body of Mrs. Harper's son, the bread heavy in his hands, he could feel the creature's presence. Watching. Waiting. He ate the bread, choking down the bitter taste of sin, and as he did, he heard the whisper in his ear. More. The creature was growing stronger, and Samuel was its vessel. The sins of Hollow Creek were piling up, one after another, feeding the darkness. Samuel knew what was coming. He could feel it in his bones. The town would fall. And when it did, Samuel would be the last one standing, an empty shell, consumed by the very evil he had tried to cleanse. He sat down at his old, creaky desk and opened his notebook. In shaky handwriting, he scrawled a single word at the top of the page. Help. But even as he wrote it, he knew no one was coming to save him.